In this video, I want to talk about the development of the ritual of the funeral of the Pope. Much has been said in recent weeks of the reform of the ceremonial ahead of the funeral of the late Pope Francis. In truth, papal funerals were considerably reformed in the 20th century. Changes started to be made with the funeral of Pius XII in 1958, with major revision and a lot of simplification for the funeral of Paul VI in 1978. What Pope Francis has done ahead of his own funeral is just to simplify things a little further while maintaining the core elements of the tradition. So I'm first going to explore with you the fullness and splendour of the traditional papal funeral ceremonial as it was before the 20th century reforms, before then looking at what has been changed in the last 60 years or so. Up to and including the funeral of Pope John XXIII in June of 1963, the funeral rituals of the Pope were long, drawn out and extraordinarily elaborate. They were in essence ceremonies from the late Middle Ages. Unsurprisingly, given that popes were major temporal as well as spiritual rulers at least until 1870, these ceremonies differed very little from those that accompanied the death and burial of any Catholic sovereign in late medieval Europe. Once you finish this video, it would be well worth you watching my other video on the funeral of Henry VIII of England, just to see how the two compare. There's very little difference. The modern idea that a powerful man, and popes are still powerful people, might have a simplified funeral, a simple funeral, would have been completely unthinkable to people in the past. A show of pomp and prestige and a certain degree of theatricality and display was an expectation for the funerals of all the social elite, as it underlined the continuing importance of the office and the position that they held. Pomp and splendour continued to be a hallmark of papal funerals right up until 1963, and it therefore provides a fascinating insight into the sumptuousness of late medieval and early modern Catholic funerary rites in general. It was the natural conservatism and the guarding of tradition within the Catholic Church, as well as a certain degree of insularity due to political changes, that ensured that these ceremonies were retained for so very long, when in nearly every other instance, due to changing social attitudes, such grand funerals were the thing of the past in Europe. There is a wonderful source in French from the 19th century that provides a detailed account of the procedure and ceremonial of papal funerals at that time, and it will form the basis of my account of papal funerals before the 1970s reforms. Entitled Le Conclave et le Pape, the Conclave and the Pope, it was written by Monsignor Xavier Barbier de Montaut in 1878. Monsignor de Montaut was a historian whose work focused on the liturgy and antiquities of the Catholic Church, and this work includes a very detailed exposition of all the rituals surrounding the death and the burial of the Pope as they were performed in his time. To this we can add a range of other sources, particularly the copious number of photographs and engravings from the late 19th and 20th century, and even from the middle of the 20th century, the evidence of film and newsreels. Before the 1990s, there was no formal instruction manual for the funeral of a Roman pontiff. Tradition, precedent, and the will of the departing pope controlled what ritual would take place. It was only in the year 2000 that the rites were formalised in a volume called Ordo Exequarum Romani Pontificis, the order for the funeral of Roman pontiffs, which in 2024 Pope Francis then revised. So let's begin where the whole funeral begins, with the domestic rituals surrounding the death of the Pope. One thing that differs from the modern papacy is that during the course of papal history, popes have very rarely occupied the apostolic palace at the Vatican. Medieval popes, before the papacy was moved to Avignon in southern France, primarily lived at the Lateran Palace beside the papal basilica of St. John Lateran, the Pope's own cathedral, and many popes died there. It was only after the end of the Avignon papacy and the end of the Western Schism in the early 15th century, and with the Lateran Palace then in very poor condition due to a number of fires, that popes began to reside at the Apostolic Palace next to St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican, which was newly built from 1447 onwards. However, their residence there was relatively brief, From the 1580s until 1870, the primary residence of the Pope was the newly built Quirinal Palace, and most popes in that period died there. It was only in 1870, with the unification of Italy, the end of the Papal States, and the seizing of the Quirinal, that popes began to reside more permanently at the Apostolic Palace in the Vatican and died there. Of course, the location of the Pope's death dictated to some degree the form of the ceremony as it would unfold. On his deathbed, a pope was rarely alone. He was accompanied there by his household, his prelates, his chaplains, and members of the wider papal court. Also in attendance, once the Pope's death seemed imminent, were members of the community of Vatican penitentiaries, the Vatican confessors, who since 1774 have been Franciscan friars. They would have a role in caring for the body of the deceased Pope. As soon as the Pope breathed his last, the members of the household in attendance covered his face with a white cloth and began immediately the funeral rites. An official called the prefect of the pontifical ceremonies then went and informed the Cardinal Camerlengo that the Pope had died. The Cardinal Camerlengo, or papal chamberlain, was the most powerful official at the papal court, and during the time when the papacy was vacant, he acted as a form of regent. And given his important status and power, it was his role to officially determine the death of the Pope. On arrival at the Pope's chamber, the Camerlengo first knelt in prayer before he began the formal work of determining the Pope's death. The cloth was removed from the Pope's face, and the Camerlengo ascertained if life was truly extinguished by calling the Pope by his baptismal name 3 times and asking him in Latin, "Tu dormis or tu vivis?" Are you asleep or are you alive? And then striking the Pope's temple each time with the silver hammer. Now I have read that the use of the silver hammer is a bit of a myth, but de Monte records it, as do other sources, and so I'm relating it. Having performed this ceremony, the Camerlengo then covered the Pope's face once again, and then announced to the household in Latin, "Veri Papa mortuus est," truly the Pope is dead. It was at that moment that the See of Rome became officially vacant. Popes traditionally wear a ring that is known as the annulus piscatoris, the ring of the fisherman. It bears on it an engraved depiction of St. Peter casting his net into the water. In the Middle Ages, this ring was used to seal the bulla, the formal documents that were sent out by the papacy, though in the early modern period, up until 1842, it was used only to seal lesser papal documents called briefs. One of the first actions the Camerlengo had to perform was to remove this ring and then to destroy it, so that it couldn't be used by unscrupulous persons. After these ceremonies, the papal chamber was closed until the next day, when the body would then be prepared for the upcoming funeral rites. Popes have long been embalmed prior to their funerals, a necessity given that there was at least a 6-day delay between the death of the pontiff and his burial. The embalming generally took place on the morning of the day after the Pope's death, and it was undertaken by the papal surgeons. From the 14th century until 1903, the primary method of embalming was the removal of all the internal organs of the Pope, the viscera, which were known in Rome as the precordia of the Pope. Some medieval popes frowned upon this practice of evisceration, and in 1299 Boniface VIII actually banned it, but it didn't stop it happening. It was during the time of the Avignon papacy in the 14th century that it became the normative practice. This was due to the influence of the Pope's French surgeon, Guy de Chauliac, who was a strong proponent of the method and developed different protocols for the embalming of lean and adiposal corpses. After evisceration, the body of the Pope was rubbed with balm with oil impregnated with sweet spices, hence the term embalming. It was a sensible procedure, particularly in the Mediterranean climate, for although it compromised the whole integrity of the body, it stopped the rapid decay of the corpse. This form of embalming required the disposal of the entrails of the deceased in as quick and convenient a manner as possible. In 1590, at his death, the Precordia of Sixtus V, the first pope to die at the Quirinal, were taken to the parish church in which the palace lay, the church of St Vincent and Anastasius in Trevi, fronting onto the Trevi fountain, and this started a long-lasting papal tradition. The church was rebuilt in the mid-17th century, and a chamber was constructed behind the high altar to contain the papal entrails and hearts. On the evening of the day of the Pope's death, the Precordia were sealed within a large ceramic vessel. Here is the sealing ceremony of Leo XIII's Precordia in 1903. They were then taken by coach and deposited in the chamber in the church. The Precordia of 22 popes are kept in the church, including those of Leo XIII, who in 1903 was the last pope to be embalmed in this manner. Since 1903, more modern processes of embalming have generally been used, though occasionally these have gone dreadfully wrong, as they did in the case of Pius XII in 1958, but that's another story. The first 2 days following the Pope's death, the body remained within the private setting of the palace. After embalming, the Pope was dressed in what is termed his choir dress, his white wool cassock with a white garment over it called a rochet, and over his shoulders a red fur-lined winter mozzetta, a form of cape, and on his head a red velvet fur-lined hat called the camaro. Thus he was laid out on his bed in his private chamber. On the second day after his death, the Pope's body was then laid out in state on a temporary bed that was put up in one of the principal chambers of the palace under a canopy. If he died in the Quirinal, he was placed in the principal hall of the palace, now known as the Great Hall of the Cuirassiers, while in the Apostolic Palace in the Vatican, the lying in state took place in the Clementine Hall. It was following the removal of the Pope's body from his chamber to the hall that the private apartments of the Pope were then sealed by the Camerlengo until a conclave elected a new Pope. On the evening of the second day after the Pope's death, if the Pope had died in the Quirinal, the body was then moved to the Vatican. It was taken there on a canopied bier carried by 2 horses, with the Vatican penitentiaries carrying torches beside it. The procession was accompanied by the noble, Palatine and Swiss guards of the papacy. This 18th century engraving even shows them bringing along their artillery. The body of the Pope was taken directly to the Sistine Chapel, the Capella Magna, the great chapel of the papal court or household in the Apostolic Palace. If the Pope died in the Vatican, the body was moved at much the same time from the Clementine Hall to the Sistine Chapel. The body was then placed at the centre of the Sistine Chapel, where during the course of the night, the Vatican penitentiaries redressed the Pope's body in the full pontifical vestments of his office, with a gold mitre placed upon his head. Following a long-held tradition, the vestments put on the Pope for his funeral and burial were invariably red. Here, under Michelangelo's famous ceiling, the Pope lay overnight on a sloping, elevated bier or platform that was known as a Cataletto. They were surrounded by multiple wax candles, with the Vatican penitentiaries keeping vigil all night. On the morning of the third day after the Pope's death, the chapter of St Peter's Basilica came to collect the body of the pontiff from the Sistine Chapel, and it was given into their care by the Vatican penitentiaries. It was then carried by 8 priests in solemn procession on a bier down the Scala Regia, the great staircase of the palace, to St Peter's Basilica, escorted by the whole papal household, the Pope's chaplains, the chapter of the Basilica, and the Pontifical Guard. The cardinals, walking 2 by 2, took up the rear. The Pope's body was then laid on cushions on a 5 or 6 foot tall Cataletto for a 3-day public lying in state. From at least 1615 and the funeral of Innocent XII, which took place shortly after the nave of the present basilica was completed, until the funeral of Pius XI in 1939, the lying in state took place in the Blessed Sacrament Chapel, which was halfway up the nave of the basilica. The chapel is divided from the basilica by a wrought iron screen, which for the duration of the lying in state was kept closed. The body of the Pope was displayed on a Cataletto that was tilted at a steep angle, which enabled those who filed past the body to see it well. De Monteau tells us that in the 19th century, the feet of the Pope were placed very close to the screen so that people could kiss the Pope's feet without entering the chapel. And in this engraving of the lying in state of Pius IX in 1878, you can see the faithful doing just that. It seems that for subsequent papal funerals, the Cataletto was then placed further into the chapel. Just as in the Sistine Chapel, the Cataletto was surrounded by candles, in this case by 24 standard candlesticks placed around the body in an arc. During this time, requiem masses and offices for the dead for the deceased pontiff were celebrated in both the Sistine Chapel and in the chapel of the choir in the basilica, the chapel used by the basilica chapter, which was directly across the nave from the chapel of the Blessed Sacrament, where the Pope was lying in state. A lying in state of a corpse on a Cataletto was a feature of the funerary traditions of all prominent men in the Middle Ages, popes, bishops, emperors, kings and nobles. I should say a brief word about what the lying in state was for when originally conceived in this period. Now today it has become primarily an opportunity for people to pay their respects to the deceased individual, and it was that to a degree in the past too. However, the ceremony of exposing the dead corpse dressed in the particular robes of their state, their status, developed in Europe as a way of proving to the populace, in the Pope's case to the people of Rome, that their ruler was indeed really dead. That was important for the sake of his smooth succession, particularly at a time when there was no mass media, and there was rivalry for power and a lot of factionalism, and often very rudimentary conventions governing the transition of power. On the evening of the 6th day after the pontiff's death, the lying in state ended, and the ceremonies for the burial of the Pope began. Before the funeral of Pius XII in 1958, the body of the Pope was taken down from the Cataletto and was taken to the chapel of the choir to be placed in the coffin. When it was taken down, it was immediately placed upon a cloth of gold shroud that was lined with red silk and was transported in it to the chapel. The Pope's body would then be placed in a triple coffin, but for more information on the form of that, see my earlier video on that subject. The Pope's body would first be placed in an inner coffin of cypress, still in the shroud, and a white cloth would be placed over his face. And into the coffin were placed a number of objects that related to his pontificate. The first object to go in was a purse that contained within it 3 bags of coins, gold, silver and copper. The gold coins were equal in number to the years of the Pope's pontificate, the silver to the months beyond that number of years, and the bronze to the days beyond the months. The most important object placed into the coffin was a scroll of parchment called the Rogito in Italian. On it was written an account of the Pope's life and reign. The scroll would be read aloud by the prefect of pontifical ceremonies before being placed inside a metal tube and then put in the coffin at the Pope's feet. Then the cypress coffin was enclosed in a shell of lead, which was soldered shut, and then that was placed into an outer case of elm. Thus completed, the chapter of St. Peter's Basilica would then take the body to its burial place. It is a quite extraordinary detail of these rituals, but up to and including Pius X in 1914, popes were not taken immediately to their final burial place, but were interred by the chapter of the basilica in a temporary tomb within the basilica itself. This was known as the Sepolcro Provisorio, the provisional tomb. In the 19th century, when de Monteau was writing, this provisional tomb had a designated place in the basilica, and it was a really curious one too. It was raised up above a doorway that led to the sacristies, in between the chapel of the choir and the neighbouring chapel of the Presentation. The papal coffin had to be hoisted up by block and tackle or by a crane to a marble sarcophagus placed in this elevated position. After the coffin had been deposited inside, the front opening of the sarcophagus was then sealed with a marble stone bearing the Pope's name, and on top of the sarcophagus was placed a cushion and papal tiara made of stucco. The coffin sometimes remained in this provisional burial place for many years, until another burial place had been prepared. This sarcophagus is no longer extant. Its former position is taken up now by the monument of Pope Pius X, erected there in 1924. Incidentally, at the time of Pius X's death in 1914, Leo XIII was still occupying the Sepulchro Provisorio. In his will, Leo had requested to be buried in the Basilica of St. John Lateran, but the Vatican postponed this translation until 1916, mostly out of fear. In 1881, when Pius IX had been translated to the Lateran, there were riots in the streets and the Pope's body nearly ended up being thrown into the Tiber, and the Vatican were unwilling to have a repeat performance of that. As there was nowhere to put Pope Pius X when he died in 1914, he was therefore buried in a void in the wall in the Chapel of the Presentation. Pius X would remain interred here for a number of years until his tomb in the Vatican grottos below the Basilica was completed, and in this photograph you can see the workmen putting in place the stone to cover this temporary burial place. Incidentally, this spot is right next to the altar where the relics of that Pope saint now lie. After the burial of the Pope, then begins a 9-day period of mourning, called the Novum Diales in Latin. On each of these 9 days, a requiem mass and absolutions for the dead would be performed for the deceased pontiff in St. Peter's Basilica. In the absence of the body as a focus of this, on the night of the 6th day, an enormous towering structure called a catafalque was erected between the papal altar and the altar of the chair of St. Peter in the Basilica, which is where the requiem masses for the Pope would then be celebrated. This catafalque was a funerary accoutrement that was also developed in the late Middle Ages and was common throughout Western Europe. It is a type of furnishing that medieval English people would call a hearse. A multi-tiered pyramidal structure covered in candles. At its top was an empty coffin covered in a black funerary pall and topped with the papal tiara. A second catafalque was also erected in the centre of the Sistine Chapel on the evening of the 3rd day after the Pope's death to provide a focus for requiems and continuing funeral rites there. The funeral of Pope John Paul XXIII was the last time that both of these catafalques were erected. The ceremonial must have been quite breathtaking and majestic to witness, but by the mid-20th century, this form of courtly ritual seemed at odds with a papacy that was increasingly less monarchical, and so reform began. The first small changes made to this traditional pattern were seen at the funeral in 1958 of Pope Pius XII. His Cataletto, just as tall as previous ones, was put in a new position at the very head of the nave of the basilica in the space before the confessio that opens up to the burial place of St. Peter. Barriers were placed around it and people were allowed to file past on both sides. When John XXIII's funeral took place in 1963, a similar configuration was used, but the Cataletto was placed on the other side of the confessio on the steps of the papal altar. For both of these two popes, the number of candles was reduced from 24 to 12. The closing of the coffins of these two pontiffs took place on the 6th day, as per tradition, but beside the papal altar, and rather than being buried in a temporary tomb, the closed coffins were then winched down through the confessio into the Vatican grottos, where they were immediately buried. The catafalque was then erected to form a focus, just as before, for the rest of the period of mourning. Wholesale changes came in 1978 for the funeral of Pope Paul VI, which of course followed the liturgical revolution of the Second Vatican Council. The earlier parts of the ceremonial remained more or less unchanged. The Pope's body continued to remain in the papal residence until the third day after death, although the lying in state in the Sistine Chapel was abandoned, with the body resting in the Clementine Hall before being removed to the Basilica. Of course, the noble and the Palatine Guards were abolished by Pope Paul VI, and so only the Swiss Guards remained to guard and accompany the Pope's body in procession. Since 1978, the Pope's body has still been carried to the Basilica on an open bier. The Vatican penitentiaries continue to be involved, accompanying the body to the Basilica as pallbearers. They walked beside the coffin of Pope Francis as he was taken to the Basilica. For Paul VI and all his successors, the public lying in state took place on the spot first used for Pius XII, directly before the Confessio. In provisions in his will, Paul VI requested that he be laid on a much lower Cataletto, and that the numerous candles be dispensed with just the Paschal candle, the Easter candle, placed to one side. This arrangement was used for the funerals of John Paul I, John Paul II, and Benedict XVI. The Cataletto has been dispensed with entirely by Pope Francis, whose body rested within his coffin, laid on a low, wedge-shaped platform for his lying in state. Since 1978, the towering catafalques that provided a focus for the obsequies during the Novum Dialis has been dispensed with entirely. This was in line with the new liturgical norms established during Paul VI's pontificate. Catafalques, as a focus for funerary rituals, were suppressed in the Novus Ordo, the new Roman Rite. Despite the lack of catafalque, requiem masses have continued to be celebrated at the Chair of St. Peter, although they are now con-celebrated by the resident cardinals. The burial of the body before the end of the funeral rites was abolished too. The culmination of the public obsequies of the Pope since 1978 has been a funeral mass, a mass of Christian burial celebrated on the 6th day after the Pope's death. This has been celebrated in St. Peter's Square in front of the Basilica. Before the Mass, the coins, the rogito, have been added to the coffin, and the inner coffin of cypress has been closed, but this ceremony has taken place directly in front of the Confessio. The coffin has then been taken outside on a bier for the funeral Mass and laid, still on the bier, on a carpet directly in front of the temporary altar erected on the steps of the Basilica. At the end of the Mass, a final commendation of the Pope has taken place, after which he is directly buried. For Paul VI onwards, straight after the Mass, the cypress coffin has then been taken to the Vatican grottos, where the final sealing of the triple coffin has then taken place directly before the interment in a permanent place of burial. Of course, Pope Francis has changed things around a bit with this, and his coffin will be permanently sealed just prior to the funeral Mass, and it will then be taken back into St. Peter's before being taken for burial at the Church of St. Maria Maggiore. Some may lament reform, but tradition is never something that can be preserved in aspic. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy this channel, you're bound to enjoy my magazine, The Antiquary. Published every month, it is a labour of love for me, and in it I explore some of the more obscure aspects of our shared history, all beautifully illustrated in full colour. It ships across the world, is offered in print and digital format, and readers give it 5 stars on Google. If you love your history like me, particularly the history of objects, buildings, people and places, why not consider subscribing? Subscribing helps support my work and the channel too. There's a link above and in the video description that takes you to the magazine website.